You're listening to the Daily Sales Tips Podcast, and I'm your host, Scott Ingram. This is the 365th episode of the podcast, which means that every single day for the last year, I've released a new sales tip for you. It's been an incredible ride, and this is just the beginning. My tips for you today are some simple podcast listening tips that I've probably shared before, but they're worth repeating as a way to help you accelerate your own learning, not just with this show, but with any podcast you're listening to. The first idea is actually new. Many podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, only make the last 300 episodes available, which is kind of a problem, especially if you're new to the show and you want to go back to episode 1. The very easiest solution I've found to solve for this is Spotify. I've come to like Spotify more and more as a podcast listening platform, and they don't seem to impose the same 300 episode limit that other platforms do. You can go to Spotify and scroll all the way down to episode 1 and play away. The other thing it does that I like a lot, especially for this show, is what I call auto binge. If you were to start playing at episode 1, it will keep automatically playing each episode in order until you tell it to stop. So no need to do all of the work of, clicking on the next episode. Hopefully that helps, and thanks largely, I believe, to that feature in particular, this show has become the #1 sales podcast on Spotify. So thank you so much for regularly listening to the show and for sharing it with your other friends and colleagues in sales. It means a lot and definitely keeps me going, knowing just how many of you are out there listening to this each and every day. My other suggestion is to speed up your listening. Virtually every podcast app will allow you to do this with varying degrees of control. Spotify has options for 1.2x, 1.5x, 2x, and 3x. Apple Podcasts will allow you to listen at 1.5 speed or double speed. And if you really want granular control, one of my other favorite podcast apps, Pocket Casts, will allow you to adjust in 1/10 increments all the way up to 3x. I've found that if you work your way up and maybe start at 1.5x for a while and then move up to 2x over time, it becomes pretty natural. The result? Twice the content in the same amount of time. And for me, it actually forces me to focus a little more, and it's less likely that my mind will wander on to other things. So give that a try and join me as a pod faster. The other takeaway here is just the consistency. I'm sure this show wouldn't be nearly as popular as it is had I been more sporadic and less disciplined in my approach. If you've been listening to this show for any length of time, you know I'm a big believer in consistency. Heck, I think I talked about it yesterday, and I work really hard to try to live that. I'm not perfect. It definitely helps that I'm able to create these episodes in batches and I don't actually have to work on it every single day. But in other areas of my life, I definitely do. And I just find that the more consistent I act, the more consistent my results are. So here's to you, here's to your consistency, here's to your results, and here's to another year of great sales tips every single day. Thanks for listening, and be sure to come back tomorrow for another great sales tip.